Hi, Facebook. I'm Willis Sparks for Eurasia Live. This is my very good friend, Hani Sabra.
Hi, Willis.
Hi, Hani. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Hani is the head of our entire Middle East practice here at Eurasia Group. So he covers a lot of countries. One of them is Egypt, which is what we want to talk about today.
Which is where I'm from as well.
Which is where you're from as well, from Cairo. Because the Egyptian president is in Washington today, and we wanted to talk about that. By the way, thank you for cleaning up that mess where you spilled water on the table.
You're very welcome.
That's really nice of you. Did you use your? I don't see any napkins. Did you use your sleeve for that?
I used the part of my sleeve that actually has some toothpaste on it from this morning.
This is the kind of resourcefulness that you have to have in this kind of work that we do at Eurasia Group. So, in all seriousness, let's start. So, Sisi was in Washington today. He met with Trump.
Yep.
And they look like old pals.
Yep.
You know, there's a lot of attention later in the week to Xi Jinping. The Chinese president's going to be at Mar-a-Lago. It's going to be the most awkward social couple of days in history.
Yeah.
But with Sisi, these guys look very comfortable together. And it made me think about how, if you go back before the Arab Spring and before Barack Obama was elected president, and as you were pointing out earlier, really before 9/11 really changed the relationship, what we have now today with Sisi and Trump appears, at least on the surface, to be a throwback to an earlier period when the two were very pragmatic allies in the region. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I would say that there's been awkwardness in the Egypt-U.S. relationship for a long time, for at least 15 years. There was awkwardness in the relationship under Obama, for very obvious reasons, because of the post-Arab Spring environment, and then because of the environment following the coup in 2013.
Right.
But things weren't very good between the Egyptians and the Americans under George W. Bush, because if you recall, you had figures like Condoleezza Rice and even the president himself and people like Paul Wolfowitz who were pushing this idea that democracy and democratization were good for the Arab world, that they were stabilizing things. And Mubarak was still a close ally to the U.S. at the time, but that did create some awkwardness. So if you're thinking about it in terms of a throwback, it's probably more like the Bill Clinton, Hosni Mubarak relationship in the 90s, right? Where Egypt was a critical player in the region. Egypt was important to the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, which at the time
had been since President Carter was in office.
Exactly, but I mean in the 90s, which was the period in which there actually was an Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Now it doesn't really exist.
Right.
So yeah, I mean this is it's been a long time since you've had this comfortable relationship between Egypt and the United States, and I would say that I would go even further. I would say that when you think about what I did, at least on November 9th. Who are the leaders that most benefit from this surprise election of Donald Trump? The first person that came to my mind was Abdel Fattah al-Sisi.
Why?
The most. Because he's the person that, essentially has very little to lose from Trump winning, right? I mean, he basically sees Trump as somebody who is very hostile to Islamist movements. And I think there's a bit of Sisi's slightly deluding himself into what Trump and some of the people around him think, and Trump and the people around him are slightly deluding themselves into what Sisi believes. But I mean, in terms of how Sisi looked at November 9th was, here's a president who shares my distaste for Islamists, and here's a guy
who's not going to lecture me on human rights the way Hillary Clinton certainly would have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? And so it was all upside for him.
Yeah.
Right?
So let's be a little bit more specific. Now that they had their meeting, they had their handshake.
Yeah.
What does Sisi want from Trump in terms of actual deliverables? What does he hope to go home with?
Yeah, I would say that there's probably two primary things, and maybe one that's pretty secondary. And none of these things have to be made public, right? It's not as if there has to be a press conference where Donald Trump says, "I promise President Sisi the following." But I think the two primary things he wants is some sort of guarantee that in an environment of America first, that Egypt still gets its military aid from the United States.
We should point out that Egypt has been for a long time and continues to be the second largest recipient of U.S. military aid in the world.
After Israel.
Far behind Israel, but still, between Israel and Egypt, that's 75% of all U.S. military aid. Big gap. But being number two is a big deal. It's a lot of money. It's more than $1 billion.
Yeah.
And you certainly, you sound like that Sisi, in your opinion, is confident that's going to continue.
I think he's fairly confident about that. So that's the one thing he'd like. The second thing I think he'd like is to get some sort of commitment from the administration about designating the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. I think that will be harder for him to achieve, but that's his second objective. And the third one, again, which I think is secondary, is to basically get the United States to not move the U.S. embassy from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, or from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I don't think that Sisi...
Good luck with that one.
Well, I don't think that Sisi is thinking about it from the perspective of what does this mean for a future Palestinian state. I think what he's worried about is the effect of that on regional stability.
Right, and the costs that might come with it for him personally. Mm-hmm. All right, well, we'll come back to the Muslim Brotherhood in a moment, but I realize you obviously cover the Middle East, not the U.S., but do you have a sense of what Donald Trump would like to get from Sisi?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what Trump probably wants from Sisi, or how Trump thinks about Sisi, is he thinks about him as a dependable ally in the region, right? I think that Trump
which matters a lot for him. The dependability of his allies is obviously something important to any president.
Yeah, I mean, I think
for a president that doesn't have any foreign policy experience, it's even bigger than it would be for another president.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I think he thinks of Egypt and he thinks of Sisi as somebody who could be an ally in the fight against ISIS. And when you think about Trump's, that's one of his main focuses in the region, or he claims that that's his main focus in the region.
Yeah.
And he sees that Sisi is somebody who's established his anti-Islamist bona fides, then he thinks that this is a guy I can work with. He also just likes that Sisi's a nationalist. He's a tough guy.
Yeah.
I don't follow Trump's Twitter feed that closely, but I do remember in 2011, Donald Trump did tweet about Hosni Mubarak and said, it would have been better for Mubarak to stay in power, or something like that, basically.
And I read something interesting that you wrote in the last week or so that said that about the laptop ban.
Yeah.
Egypt is one of the countries that flights from that country to the U.S., you're not, at a certain point, you're not going to allow to have laptops in the cabin.
Yeah.
And the point that you made was very interesting, that that's actually not only not a problem for Egypt, but in a way, it helps Sisi advance an internal argument that he makes at home.
Yeah, Sisi is not, he's not going to come here and say my priority to Trump, one of my priorities when I meet with Donald Trump is to pressure him to remove this laptop ban. He's not going to care about that. I think what he's going to say is, how can I,
They're giving you more water.
Yeah,
they're giving
that's very
more
kind
water
of
at this point.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for the extra water.
It must look like my mouth is dry.
Well, I just suddenly saw this hand moving and we thought...
But yeah, I think
Sisi
is basically going to say, okay, well, they have this laptop ban, and I'm going to use that domestically back home to say to the Egyptian public, look, in the pursuit of security, sometimes you need to basically take steps that make people uncomfortable. If they do it in democratic America, then you here in Egypt should be willing to accept that we sometimes do these things as well.
And the Trump administration is recognizing from Sisi's point of view that Egypt has a problem with domestic terrorism that justifies extreme measures on the Egyptian government's part, at least in Sisi's mind they do, to clamp down, to beat back that terrorism.
I mean, that's not what an Egyptian human rights activist would say, but
of course.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So is there anything, well, actually, let's talk about the Muslim Brotherhood for a second.
Sure.
Let me ask an extreme ignorance question here.
Okay.
When the question is about banning the Muslim Brotherhood, are we referring specifically to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or is this an attempt to create a kind of global ban on Muslim Brotherhoods in other countries as well?
Well, I mean, what Sisi would like is sort of a broader, not ban of the Muslim Brotherhood, a designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization.
Yeah.
Right. That's what he's looking for. So I think that's what Sisi would prefer. I think that given how sort of the Muslim Brotherhood functions domestically in countries as a very hierarchical organization, but the International Muslim Brotherhood is less so, right? So there are some linkages between these groups. So it would be a much more difficult thing to do, right? And that would put the U.S. in an awkward position vis-a-vis, countries like countries like Tunisia, which, part of the leadership there is a Nahda, which is an Islamist movement that is loosely associated with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
And, even the AK party in Turkey, again, not the Muslim Brotherhood, but has, Islamist leanings. There'd be some awkwardness there. So no, I think that if it were to happen, again, I think that Sisi will have a problem achieving this. But if it were to happen, I think it would be a narrower.
And I think it's
definition.
worth taking a moment for audiences outside the region. You hear the Muslim Brotherhood referred to in the media all the time, and a lot of people don't have a sense of what actually a large and complicated organization the Muslim Brotherhood is. This is not Hamas, this is not Hezbollah. It's an older organization, it's an international organization, and it fulfills many functions, right?
I mean, you could say that about Hamas and Hezbollah as well, though. Mm-hmm. It's just a different organization. It's as I said, it is an Egyptian organization originally. It was started by a gentleman named Hassan al-Banna in 1928.
Right.
But, it expanded, and as I said, there are linkages between the various Muslim Brotherhood branches around the Arab and Muslim world, but it's not, an organization that is based, for example, in a city, and that central Muslim Brotherhood group controls the rest of
But it is also an organization that provides social services and encourages education in various formats. It's not simply, I think a lot of Americans just assume it's a big terrorist organization.
Yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood is not Al-Qaeda, it's not Daesh, it is not one of those groups,
right.
no.
Okay. Right. Last point, let's talk a little bit about Egypt's future, because you've also made the point that while Egypt is certainly stable for the moment, there are longer-term issues below the surface that maybe 2-3 years from now could become a problem for Sisi over time. So, for example, there have been some protests recently around the availability of subsidized bread, which is
small protests.
Small protests, but this has been an issue in Egypt in the past, right? That the military provides subsidized bread at prices that people can afford, and when
technically it's not the
goes
military.
away,
technically, the military does not provide subsidized bread. The state does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So here's how to think about it. I would say that.
But we're talking about inflation for food, inflation for gasoline.
Yes.
These are economic issues that are creating problems. And you made the point recently in writing that the 6 million Egyptians who work in the civil service that are government employees are not seeing their wages go up as fast as inflation, and that over time that can create political problems for Sisi.
Yeah. So here's how I think about it. So there's Egypt today, right? And Egypt today is fairly stable, right? You have the security establishment that runs the country, these security agencies. These folks are generally getting along. The security environment has improved. So these guys have basically given the civilian leadership a bit of leeway to manage the economy. They've reached an agreement with the IMF. They're implementing some reforms. So things look a bit better on the surface. But then under the surface, you have what you said, inflation and people getting more concerned about their economic future, right? What you don't have is an opposition or an opposition leader that can bring these various people that are feeling insecure about the economy or about other issues together under the banner of, a movement. Now, Egypt is having a presidential election in 2018, which Sisi will win, absolutely. But that does give the opportunity for Sisi's critics to perhaps bring, people who are unhappy about his rule together, right? And present some sort of challenge to the central authorities.
So this hypothetical rival that we're talking about that could consolidate some political support and challenge Sisi, where is that person likely to come from? Is he likely to come from within the current government? Are we talking about an internal schism? Or is there an opposition party, or maybe even someone outside the country that's capable of playing that role?
I like how you referred to him as he. You just assumed for certain that it's a man.
I thought about that, and yes, but I do assume that, and I think you do too, right?
It's a high probability that it's a man.
Yeah.
So I would say that whoever the person is that is considering potentially challenging Sisi in 2018, if they're smart, they're not going to declare that they're a challenger to Sisi right now, because
They're not going to run against him in 2018.
No, I'm saying they're not going to run against him in 2017. They're not going to prep to run against him in 2018 by beginning a campaign in 2017, because your name would be dragged through the mud. You would be criticized. I mean, the private and state media is very pro-government, and they basically rip you to shreds. So whoever that person is, we're not going to know who that person is, for the next several months. It could be somebody from within the system.